All right, so if we can write our objective today, which is working with the percent proportion. Today's date, happy Thanksgiving. AMDG, we do this for the greater glory of God, and math task 53. You can pause the video if you need to write that down. Now, a quick reminder of what we looked at on Friday, as well as what we've looked at enough times, this idea of the percent proportion. So the percent bar is a great way to think about percents, right? We know that the whole bar, the whole thing, whatever you're talking about, is always 100%. All of it is 100%. Nothing of it is 0%. And whatever you want on there, like 50% is right in the middle, whatever percent is somewhere between 0 and 100 usually. And that matches with the part, right? Whatever part of the item you have, that's the number, and that's out of the total. So we can write part over total, right? The part that you have over the total of whatever, how big the bar is always equal to the percent over 100. That's always going to be 100 because the total is always 100%. That's the definition of 100%. So if you can write this down, this is a key thing to remember, right? The percent bar is to help us visualize. The percent proportion is there to help us calculate. We're going to use that today. So part over total equals percent over 100. We saw that on the Ed puzzle on Friday. So we've talked a little bit about budgeting. So let's say a scenario where you have an income of about $50 in a month, and you that month spend $10 on gaming. So maybe different things online or a controller, whatever it might be. So you spend 10 of your $50 on gaming. We want to know what percent of my budget am I spending on gaming? It's good to kind of understand, right? Because $10 might be a lot to some people, but it might only be a little bit to others, depending on what your income is. So in this case, $10 is out of 50. So how would I set that up? Well, remember, $50 is the total and $10 is the part. All right. So I would set up the equation this way. Remember, it's part over total equals percent over 100. So in this equation, it's 10 over 50 is equal to some number over 100, some percent. We're trying to find that percent out. Well, what we saw in the video on Friday is you can understand that these are proportional, right? And proportional means that if you multiply by the same factor, right? We saw this a lot in Unit 1. If you multiply both numbers by the same factor, then it stays proportional. Well, here I know 100 divided by 50 is 2. In other words, 50 times 2 is 100. And since they're equal, I have to multiply by 2. 10 times 2. Well, I know 10 times 2 is 20. Therefore, the proportion becomes 10 over 50 equals 20 over 100. These are equal, right? I could reduce this and get 10 over 50, so they'd be equal. And what that means is $10 out of $50 means it's 20% of my income. So if somebody has an income of $50 in a month and spends $10 on gaming, they've just spent 20% of their income on gaming, meaning they only have 80% of their income left. Let's look at another example. Let's say a different person only makes $20 in a month, but they also want to spend $10 on gaming. Well, we know that the total is 20 because that's how much they made, and the part is 10 because that's how much they spent. So here their percent proportion becomes 10 over 20. Instead of 10 over 50, it's 10 over 20 because they only made $20, but it still equals percent over 100. And since it's proportional, we have to multiply by the same factor. So we have to figure out what factor, what do I multiply 20 by to get 100? Well, I know 100 divided by 20 is 5, so that must mean 20 times 5 is 100. And to keep it proportional, I must multiply 10 times 5, which I know is 50. So 10 over 20 equals 50 over 100. And what does that tell me? That tells me if I spend 10 out of $20, I'm actually spending 50% of my income on gaming. So you can tell that even though they both spent $10, this person spent less of their income than this person. This person spent 50%, and that percent proportion was able to tell me that. Let's look at one more example. Now, this third person They only made $5 this month. Maybe they didn't have a job. They just got maybe some allowance or something like that. And they only made $5 this month. But they also spent $10 on gaming. Well, that's a strange situation because their part is actually bigger than their total. Now, that can happen. Now, what does that proportion look like? Now that looks a little lopsided, right? The bigger number's on top. So they spent 10 out of their $5. 5 is still the total, even though it's smaller, because that was how much income they had. And percent out of 100, right? We still know that is always true. And the mathematics still exists, right? What times 5 is 100? Well, 100 divided by 5 is 20. That means I multiply 5 times 20 to get 100, which means I must multiply 10 times 20 to get this percent. Well, I know that 10 times 20 is 200. So 10 over 5 equals 200 over 100, right? Which makes sense. They're both twice as big as the denominator. But what that means is this person, if they spend 10 out of their $5, that's 200% of their income on gaming. That means they spent more than they made. And you may say, well, that's impossible. And so remember, credit cards, right? This can happen with irresponsible use of credit cards, right? You can use a credit card to buy something before you have the cash. So that must be what happened here. He only made $5 in the month, but he spent 10. He must have used a credit card, which, as we know, is going to come back to haunt him. So the percent proportion, again, is part over total equals percent over 100. And don't get lost and think that the bigger number is always the denominator. Usually it is, but not always. You got to always look back and say, what is the total and what is the part?